This is Emily Rowley, and this is my logic model presentation. My logic model presentation was based off from data collected during my action research project for EDU 595 in the fall of 2015. The learning problem that was identified came from two data points: our standardized local assessment, NWEA, and a placement test from the math program MobyMax. NWEA reported that 68% of students grades 3 through 5 partially met or did not meet district standards in the domain of geometry and measure. MobyMax reported that 37% of students grades 3 through 5 could not master the previous year's geometry targets. The learning goal for this learning problem was to explore the reasons for the weaknesses in order to create learning opportunities for students in the areas of geometry and measure, to have each grade level increase by a mean of 5 RIT points as measured on the NWEA. Teachers would work together to identify the greatest content need, and teachers would work together over the next 2 years to identify the content need, identify where each grade level's programming overlaps in this area, and complete their math programming. This would be supported through professional development with a math coach and also cycles with a math coach, which include, but are not limited to, pre-conferences, modeling, observing, and co-teaching, post-conferences, and interpreting data, school-wide as well as classroom. One cause to this learning problem could be contributed to teachers not agreeing on what the greatest need is. They work on topics in isolation of other grades, not channeling their focus on a single target. Strategies for improving this learning problem include introducing teachers and staff to data-driven dialogue. While I had already completed the action research project, it was very necessary to have teachers arrive at their own conclusion based on the data that I had collected. I understood that their interpretation could be different from my own. If that was the case, if that had happened, I would have taken what the teachers had collectively agreed on, and I would have done my logic model presentation on that. After introducing staff and teachers to data-driven dialogue, as a group, we would observe the list of inferences made within the model and then choose the domain that a majority of teachers and staff interpret as the greatest content need. In addition to that, as grade level teams, they would create activities in addition to their programming that addresses the greatest content need. Intended outcomes for these strategies. The first outcome would be that teachers and staff would decide on the greatest content need for Rumford Elementary School, which flows into intended outcome number 2, which would be to have buy-in from the teacher staff. Instead of being told what to do, they would be an active part of the solution. And the third intended outcome was for students to gain more exposure to the greatest content area throughout the school year as opposed to a small, isolated time frame. Cause 2. Teachers do not have an understanding of what is taught in previous years in order to build on students' prior knowledge, and they don't have an understanding of what is taught in future years in order to concrete the foundational learning. Strategies for improving cause 2. Teachers would communicate in vertical teams where their programming overlaps in order to develop common vocabulary and utilize common strategies that span different grade levels. The intended outcome for these strategies is that teachers would gain insight to the common lessons taught within the programming, and that they'd work in vertical teams to develop common lesson plans and strategies for each of the overlapping lessons. With this information, teachers would be able to access the prior knowledge easier with certain vocabulary words and certain activities that the students have already been exposed to, and they'd be able to build a solid foundation with the knowledge of how it will be taught in the future. Also, with common manipulatives, strategies, and lessons, students would have better access to their prior knowledge when they can relate what they're doing to something they're familiar with. Evidence to show that the intended outcomes for the strategies are being met would be that teachers would provide documentation of lesson overlap and where they're located within the math programming. They would also have documentation in the form of formal lesson plans that they would share, and a list of common strategies and manipulatives that are used for these common topics. Cause number 3, teachers do not complete math programming, which creates learning gaps that are impossible to overcome. Due to this pattern, the widening of gaps is annually perpetual. In the Envision program that Rumford Elementary uses, geometry and measurement and data are the last topics that are taught at the end of the year. Currently, most teachers do not complete their programming, which leaves students in a situation where they're not exposed to these topics year after year. Strategies for improving cause 3. Provide support for teachers to complete their math programming. Create a pacing guide, which will allow teachers to check in on their own individual progress, and provide professional development for teachers to discern between learning strategies, which don't have to be mastered in a day and are taught and practiced over the course of the school year, and concepts, which have to be mastered in a certain time frame in order to build scaffolding for future concepts. And 4, provide professional development to train teachers to identify critical content within their math programming. Intended outcome for these strategies include teachers pacing more appropriately and changing their focus from mastery of every lesson over several days to covering the lessons that teach strategies in a day and practicing them long term while spending several days on critical content. Also, students will be exposed to all domains, eliminating the learning gaps. Teachers would use a pacing guide as a reflection tool to note which lessons are taking a long time to get through versus which lessons can be completed quickly. Evidence to show that these outcomes are being met. Teachers would generate documentation in the form of their own personal calendar that shows the progress they've made within the program and when they're making progress. Teachers would also use a reflection tool, which I've given them, a pacing guide that I've created, to streamline instruction and make more progress in programming the following year. My logic model is a work in progress, with some parts complete and other parts still being addressed. Late arrival Wednesdays. I've had the opportunity to deliver professional development during 4 late arrival Wednesdays to the entire teaching staff. During this time, we worked through the data-driven dialogue model, identified the greatest content need at Rumford Elementary School, which the teachers agreed was geometry and measure and geometry, and worked in vertical teams to identify overlapping lessons and concepts. Through my coaching, which allows me to work with 2 individuals every day for 3 weeks, 2 individual teachers every day for 3 weeks. During this time, teachers and I work to identify critical content versus strategies and generate conversations around the pacing guide. Teachers keep track of what lessons they are on and how long it takes them to complete the lessons. There are still items to be addressed. While the staff has identified the greatest need, we have not made our next steps for addressing that need. Also, teachers have not finished identifying where lessons and content overlap. Until that is completed, common lessons and strategies cannot be discussed. The timeline for completing this logic model is the end of the 2018 school year. Professional development opportunities will come in the form of coaching, late arrival Wednesdays, and workshop days.